The gunshot echoing across the Oklahoma plains made Keller Daniels pull his horse up short, his keen eyes scanning the rocky outcroppings ahead. It was 1878, and this untamed stretch near Muskogee in Indian Territory was no place to be careless. Dust swirled around his weathered boots as he dismounted, hand hovering near his Colt revolver. Keller wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding men like him. At 32, he'd spent most of his adult life drifting across the frontier, working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, taking odd jobs when money ran thin. The war between the states had ended 13 years ago, but Keller still carried its shadows with him, preferring the company of his horse and the open sky to the crowded saloons of civilization. He tied his chestnut mare, Penny, to a scrub oak and moved cautiously toward the sound, keeping low. Another shot rang out, followed by a feminine cry of frustration that made him pause. Ladies weren't common in these parts, especially not ones handling firearms. Peering over a boulder, Keller spotted her, a young woman with a hunting rifle, aiming shakily at a jackrabbit that bounded away unharmed. Her clothes were ragged but clean, her hair a wild tangle of auburn curls. Most peculiar of all was that she had emerged from what appeared to be the mouth of a small cave set into the hillside. He watched as she lowered the rifle in disappointment, her shoulders slumping. The rabbit had been dinner, he realized. His movement caused a small cascade of pebbles, and the woman whirled, raising her rifle with surprising speed. "Stay right there," she called out, voice steady despite the trembling of the barrel pointed in his direction. Keller raised his hand slowly. "Madam, I mean no harm. Just passing through and heard the shots." "Well, keep passing through then," she replied, not lowering the weapon. "You missed that rabbit by a fair piece," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than staring down the barrel of her gun. Rifles pulling to the left, her eyes narrowed. "I know how to shoot. Never said you didn't, just offering an observation." He slowly lowered his hands. "Name's Keller Daniels. I've got some jerky in my saddlebag if you're hungry." The mention of food made something flicker in her eyes, a vulnerability quickly masked. "I don't need charity from strangers. Not charity. Trade. You tell me why a lady's living in a cave and I'll share my provisions." He kept his voice gentle, the way he might approach a spooked horse. For a long moment she studied him, suspicion warring with what he guessed was hunger and loneliness. Finally, the rifle barrel dipped. "Clara," she said reluctantly. "Clara Lawson." Keller nodded, careful not to make any sudden moves as he turned toward his horse. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Lawson. Now how about we have something to eat while we talk?" Clara hesitated, then gestured toward the cave entrance with her rifle. "We can sit over there, but keep your distance, Cowboy." As they settled on flat rocks outside the cave, Keller pulled beef jerky, hardtack, and a canteen from his saddlebags. Clara ate with careful restraint, though he could tell she was ravenous. The cave behind her showed signs of extended habitation, a small fire pit, bundles of gathered herbs hanging to dry, and what appeared to be crude tools fashioned from branches and stone. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, passing her the canteen. Clara took a careful sip before answering. 6 months, give or take." "Alone," she nodded, her green eyes challenging him to comment. "That's a long spell for anyone to survive out here, let alone a woman," she finished sharply. "I manage." Keller studied her. Beneath the dirt and defensiveness, he guessed she was in her mid-20s. There was education in her speech, refinement in her bearing despite the rough circumstances. "I don't doubt it," he said sincerely, "but winter's coming. Cave like this won't keep out the cold when the northers blow through." Clara's jaw tightened. "I'll manage that too." Mind if I ask why you're here instead of somewhere with 4 walls and a roof?" When she didn't respond, he added, "Everyone's running from something, Miss Lawson. Some just run farther than others." The silence stretched between them until Clara finally spoke, her voice low. "My father died last spring. Consumption. The bank took our farm near Fort Smith. There was a man, the bank manager, who offered." She swallowed hard. "He offered an arrangement. When I refused, he made sure no one in town would hire me." Keller's expression darkened. "So you left?" "I walked until I couldn't walk anymore. Found this place. It seemed safer than towns full of men like him." She glanced at Keller with renewed wariness, as if remembering she was speaking to another such man. "Not all men are like that," Keller said quietly. "Enough are." Clara brushed crumbs from her threadbare skirt. "Thank you for the food, Mr. Daniels. You've been kind, but I prefer my solitude." Keller recognized a dismissal when he heard one, but something about this woman's determination stirred something in him. He'd been drifting too long, avoiding putting down roots since the war took everything he cared about. Maybe it was time to stop running himself. "Winter's 8 weeks away," he said, getting to his feet. "This land here, whose is it?" Clara looked surprised by the question. "No one's, I suppose. It's too rocky for farming, too far from town for most homesteaders." Keller nodded, decision forming. "I'll be back tomorrow, Miss Lawson." "I told you I don't need." "Not bringing charity," he interrupted. "Bringing lumber. That cave won't do for winter, and I've got time on my hands." Clara stood abruptly. "You can't just decide to build something on this land." "Not on your land, near it for you." He tipped his hat. "You can shoot at me when I return if you're truly opposed." Before she could argue further, he mounted Penny and turned toward town, leaving Clara staring after him with a mixture of suspicion and disbelief. True to his word, Keller returned the next day with a wagon loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies. Clara was waiting, rifle in hand, but she didn't raise it as he approached. "You were serious," she said, eyeing the wagon. "Usually am." Keller jumped down. "There's a good spot about 50 yards north of here. Higher ground, protected from the wind by those rocks, clear sight lines in 3 directions." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking anything in return, Miss Lawson. Just seems wrong to ride away knowing you'll freeze come January." "Why would you help a stranger?" Her voice held equal parts hope and doubt. Keller considered the question. "Maybe I'm tired of just passing through places. Maybe building something solid seems like a worthwhile thing to do." He didn't mention the loneliness that had been his constant companion since Appomattox, or how her fierce independence reminded him of the sister he'd lost to typhoid during the war. Clara studied the wagon's contents, then him. "I can't pay you. Not asking for payment." "I won't." Her cheeks colored slightly. "I mean, I'm not offering." "I know what you're not offering, madam," Keller said firmly, "and I'm not asking for that either. Just let me build you a cabin before the cold comes." After a long moment, Clara nodded. "I can help. I'm stronger than I look." For the next week, they worked from dawn till dusk. Keller showed Clara how to notch logs for the corners, how to mix mud and straw for chinking. She proved a quick learner, and despite her initial wariness, they fell into an easy rhythm. He taught, she adapted and improved. By the 3rd day, she was wielding an axe with practiced precision, her slender arms strengthening with each swing. They spoke little at first, but as the walls of the cabin rose, so did their comfort with each other. Keller learned that Clara had been a schoolteacher before her father's illness forced her to return to the family farm. She'd read everything from Shakespeare to scientific journals, had once dreamed of attending college back east. In turn, he told her about growing up in Missouri, about the cattle drives that had taken him through 6 territories, about the quiet satisfaction of working with his hands. He didn't talk about the war, and she didn't ask. sensing the shadow that passed over his face when conversation drifted toward those years. On the 10th day, as they were setting the last roof beams, Clara paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Why did you really come back, Mr. Daniels?" she asked. "The truth this time." Keller secured a beam before answering. "Something in your eyes reminded me of myself after the war, lost, determined to survive but not really living." He met her gaze. "Seemed like maybe we both needed something to build instead of just places to hide." Clara looked away, blinking rapidly. "It's a fine cabin," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion she clearly wasn't ready to show. It was indeed a fine cabin, small but solid, with a stone fireplace, a proper door with a wooden latch, and 2 windows covered with oiled paper to let in light. Inside, Keller had built a simple bed frame, a table with a bench, and shelves along one wall. The floor was packed earth, but he'd showed Clara how to sweep and dampen it to keep the dust down. As they stood back to admire their work on the 12th day, Clara broke the companionable silence. "You should stay for supper. I managed to trap 2 rabbits yesterday." Keller smiled. "Your aim improved." "Actually, I set snares like you showed me." A hint of pride colored her voice. "Much more effective than trying to shoot the quick little creatures." That evening marked a shift in their relationship. Seated at the rough-hewn table in the cabin they'd built together, they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew with wild onions and the last of the coffee Keller had brought from town. For the first time, Clara asked him about his plans. "Haven't really thought beyond finishing the cabin," he admitted. "Winter's coming, so the cattle drives are done for the season. Usually I'd find work at a ranch or head to Texas till spring." "But," Clara prompted, sensing his hesitation. Keller stared into his coffee cup. "But I'm not feeling the pull of the trail like I used to." Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling around the solid walls of the cabin that now stood where there had been nothing 2 weeks before. They both listened to the sound, appreciation in their eyes for the shelter they had created. "There's that patch of land to the east," Clara said quietly. "The one with the small creek running through it. Good water, decent grazing." When Keller raised an eyebrow, she added, "I've walked every inch of this area, been watching where things grow best." "You thinking of farming it?" Keller asked. Clara shook her head. "Not me. But someone could make something of it." Her eyes met his briefly before looking away. That night, as Keller rolled out his bedding beneath the stars, having refused Clara's hesitant offer to sleep on the cabin floor, he found himself considering possibilities he hadn't entertained in years. The land she'd mentioned was good. With some work, it could support a small herd, maybe some crops. It had been a long time since he'd thought about roots, about building something that would last beyond the next season. Morning brought clarity and purpose. Keller rode into Muskogee, returning 3 days later with a wagon full of supplies, seeds, tools, more household items for Clara, and paperwork from the land office. "Homestead Act," he explained, showing her the papers. 160 acres, including your cabin and that creek land to the east. 5 years of improvements and it's yours free and clear." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "Mine, but I can't. I don't have the means to. Already paid the filing fee," Keller interrupted. "Consider it payment for the fine company and the rabbit stew." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "Why are you doing this?" Keller shifted uncomfortably. "Been thinking I might winter nearby. That stretch along the creek would suit me fine for a small place. Could help you get this land producing come spring if you'd be amenable to a neighbor." The tears spilled over then, and Clara turned away to hide them. "I would be amenable to that arrangement," she managed once she had composed herself. Over the next few weeks, as Keller built his own smaller cabin a 1/4 mile from Clara's, Their lives fell into a pattern. He hunted and taught her better techniques for snaring game. She shared her knowledge of wild plants and berries. In the evenings, sometimes they'd sit by one fire or the other, Clara reading aloud from one of the few books she'd carried in her pack during her long walk from Fort Smith. November brought the first real cold, and with it, a fresh appreciation for their sturdy cabins. It also brought a shift in the way they looked at one another, lingering glances, hands brushing when passing tools or food, conversations that stretched late into the night. On Thanksgiving Day, Keller surprised Clara by appearing at her door with a wild turkey he'd shot and ingredients for a proper feast purchased on his latest trip to town. "Thought we might celebrate," he said, looking almost boyish in his nervousness. "Being neighbors and all." Clara's smile was radiant as she took the bird. "I believe that's a fine idea, Mr. Daniels." "Might be time you called me Keller," he suggested, following her inside. "Seeing as we're the only two souls for miles around." "Keller," she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. They prepared the meal together, moving around the small cabin with an easy familiarity that belied their relatively short acquaintance. Clara had arranged dried autumn leaves and late-blooming wildflowers on the table, and Keller had brought candles, small luxuries that transformed the rustic space. As they ate, Clara asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Will you really stay through winter? You're a drifter, Keller. That's what you told me when we met." He considered his answer carefully. "Been drifting since the war ended." Seemed easier than staying in one place, watching other folks build lives I didn't think I deserved anymore. "Why wouldn't you deserve a life?" Clara asked softly. Keller set down his fork, his expression distant. "I killed men, Clara, not just in battle but after. Became a cavalry scout. Did things I'm not proud of." He met her eyes directly. "You deserve to know that about me." Clara reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "The war asked terrible things of men on both sides. What matters is the man sitting before me now. The one who built a stranger a cabin and asked nothing in return." The touch of her hand on his seemed to unlock something in Keller. That night, he told her about his family's farm in Missouri, burned by raiders, about his younger sister Mary who had died while he was away fighting, about the emptiness that had driven him ever westward, never letting himself get too close to anyone or anything. "But then I heard that gunshot," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "and found this fierce woman living in a cave, too stubborn to give up despite everything life had thrown at her." He looked at Clara with wonder. "You reminded me that surviving isn't enough. There has to be something worth surviving for." The winter deepened, bringing snow and ice that transformed the landscape into a glittering, dangerous beauty. Keller and Clara checked on each other daily, sharing meals more often than not, working together to prepare for spring planting. He taught her to play checkers using pieces carved from branches. She taught him songs her grandmother had sung, her clear voice filling the cabin on long evenings when the wind howled outside. In January, a week-long blizzard kept Keller snowbound at Clara's cabin. They huddled near the fire, rationing wood and food, talking for hours about their hopes and dreams, falling asleep side by side on the floor wrapped in every blanket they owned. It was during those close quarters, those unguarded moments, that something undeniable grew between them. On the third night of the storm, Clara spoke of her fears. "I never thought I'd trust a man again after what happened in Fort Smith. I was so certain I'd be better off alone." Keller, stoking the fire, looked over at her. "And now I think perhaps I was wrong," she whispered. "At least about one man." When the blizzard finally broke, Keller reluctantly returned to his own cabin. But something had changed between them. A bridge had been crossed. though neither was quite ready to name what lay on the other side. February brought warmer days, snow melt feeding the creek until it ran full and clear. Keller began work on a corral and small barn, planning to buy horses and a few cattle when spring came in earnest. Clara prepared her garden plot, enriching the soil with compost as Keller had shown her. One crisp morning, Clara heard a wagon approaching. Stepping outside, she was surprised to see Keller returning from town earlier than expected, his wagon loaded with supplies, and a young milk cow. "Thought you might like fresh milk," he said by way of greeting. "She's gentle, already been milked this morning." Clara approached the docile brown cow, stroking her nose with delight. "She's wonderful. Does she have a name?" Seller called her Buttercup. Keller grinned. "Not very original, but it suits her." As Clara continued admiring the cow, Keller unloaded the wagon. Among the usual supplies were unexpected items: bolts of fabric, sewing needles, a proper cooking pot, and most surprising of all, a book of poetry. "What's all this?" Clara asked, touching the fabric with longing fingers. It had been so long since she'd had a new dress. "Things you might need, or want." Keller seemed uncharacteristically nervous. "There's something else, too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Clara unwrapped it to find a simple silver locket on a delicate chain. "Keller, it's beautiful, but I can't accept. I want you to have it," he interrupted. "I've been thinking, Clara, about the future, about us." Her heart began to race. "Us?" Keller took a deep breath. "I know we haven't known each other long by most standards, but out here, time measures different. We've faced more together in these months than some folks do in years of city living." He took her hand. "I never expected to find someone like you, never thought I'd want to stop drifting. But I don't want to be just your neighbor anymore." Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining. "What do you want to be?" "Your husband, if you'll have me." The words came out in a rush. "I love you, Clara Lawson. I love your courage and your mind and the way you never gave up, even when you had every reason to." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she squeezed his hand. "I love you too, Keller. I think I have since you came back with that wagon of lumber, determined to build me a home." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise of all that was to come. When they broke apart, Keller rested his forehead against hers. "We could be married in Muskogee. There's a proper church there now." Clara nodded, her heart too full for words. 6 months ago, she had been alone in a cave, simply trying to survive. Now she stood on land that would be hers, beside a man who had rebuilt not just a shelter for her body but a home for her heart. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the newly built Methodist church in Muskogee. The preacher's wife and a few townspeople Keller had befriended during his supply runs served as witnesses. Clara wore a dress she had sewn from the blue fabric Keller had brought, the silver locket gleaming at her throat. Keller had traded for a proper suit, looking so handsome it nearly took Clara's breath away. The simple words of the ceremony carried profound weight for both of them. Two people who had lost everything finding in each other the courage to begin again. Spring arrived in earnest as they settled into married life, dividing their time between the two cabins while they worked on expanding Clara's into a proper home for both of them. They planted corn, beans, and potatoes, started a small orchard of apple and peach trees, and built up a modest herd of cattle. Keller's skills from years of ranch work proved invaluable, while Clara's keen intelligence and determination made every project they undertook more successful than it might have been. By summer, they had added a second room to Clara's cabin and built a proper kitchen. The garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables and herbs. Buttercup gave rich milk daily, which Clara churned into butter to sell in town alongside eggs from the chickens they'd acquired. In late June, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the tall grass, Clara took Keller's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I think we'll need to add another room to the cabin," she said softly. "By winter." Keller's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Are you certain?" Clara nodded, her smile radiant in the fading light. "As certain as I can be. We're going to have a child, Keller." The joy that transformed his face was unlike anything Clara had ever seen. Keller gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." That night, as Clara slept beside him, Keller lay awake, overwhelmed by the turns his life had taken. A year ago, he had been a solitary drifter with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back, a man running from the ghosts of his past. Now he was a husband, a homesteader, and soon to be a father, all because he had followed the sound of a gunshot and found a woman living in a cave. The pregnancy wasn't easy. The summer heat was brutal, and despite Keller's attempts to make Clara rest, she insisted on keeping up with most of her usual tasks. By August, however, she reluctantly admitted she needed to slow down, especially as the baby grew and her body changed. Keller took over more of the household chores, hired a local Muskogee man named John to help with the heavier farm work, and made regular trips to town for supplies and to check on the arrangements he was making for the birth. The nearest doctor was in Fort Gibson, a full day's ride away, but there was a midwife in Muskogee who had agreed to come when Clara's time arrived. In September, they finished the addition to the cabin, a nursery adjoining their bedroom, with a handcrafted cradle Keller had made from oak. Clara sewed tiny gowns and blankets, often singing softly to the child growing within her as she worked. "What should we name the baby?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her feet in Keller's lap as he massaged them to ease the swelling. "If it's a girl, I thought maybe Mary," he said quietly, "after my sister." Clara squeezed his hand. "Mary is beautiful, and if it's a boy, what about Thomas, after your father, Thomas Daniels?" Clara smiled. "It has a fine sound to it." As autumn painted the surrounding hills in golds and reds, they prepared for both the coming child and the winter ahead. The harvest was good enough to see them through comfortably, and even put some aside. Keller built up their stock of firewood, insulated the cabin better than the previous year, and smoked meat to last the cold months. Clara's time came on a clear, cold night in early December. Keller had just returned from checking on the livestock when he heard her sharp intake of breath. "The baby?" he asked, immediately at her side. Clara nodded, her face a mixture of excitement and fear. "I think so. Better send for Mrs. Foster." Keller had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He helped Clara to bed, made sure she was comfortable, then saddled Penny and rode hard for town to fetch the midwife. The 8 miles had never seemed so long, every second feeling like an hour as he imagined Clara alone and in pain. Mrs. Foster, a stout woman with kind eyes and 30 years of bringing babies into the world, was ready when he arrived. They made the return journey as quickly as her wagon would allow, reaching the cabin just before midnight. "You've got good timing," Mrs. Foster told Clara after examining her. "Baby's in the right position. Now we just need to be patient." Patient was the last thing Keller felt as the hours stretched on, Clara's labor intensifying. Mrs. Foster shooed him out to the kitchen after he nearly fainted when Clara's water broke, sending him to boil more water and fetch clean linens. It was dawn when the sharp cry of a newborn finally pierced the cabin. Keller, who had been pacing the kitchen for what felt like eternity, froze at the sound. When Mrs. Foster called him in moments later, he entered the bedroom with legs that hardly seemed his own. Clara lay propped against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your son, Keller," she said softly. Thomas Daniels was perfect tiny fingers, a tuft of dark hair, his mother's determined chin. As Keller took his son in his arms for the first time, a tear slid down his weathered cheek. "Hello, Thomas," he whispered. "I'm your pa." The first year of Thomas's life brought changes and challenges neither Keller nor Clara had anticipated. The baby thrived, growing strong on his mother's milk, and later the soft foods Clara prepared. He had Keller's dark hair and Clara's bright green eyes, and a curious nature that kept both parents on their toes once he began crawling. Their homestead prospered as well. Keller's small herd grew, the orchard took root, and Clara's garden expanded to include medicinal herbs that she dried and sold to the apothecary in Muskogee. They built a larger barn, improved the corral, and added a proper root cellar for storing vegetables through winter. Word of their success spread, and by the following spring, 3 more families had settled within a few miles, creating the beginnings of a community. Clara, drawing on her experience as a teacher, began holding informal lessons for the children, including little Thomas, who sat contentedly on a blanket playing with wooden toys Keller had carved while his mother taught. On Thomas's first birthday, Keller surprised Clara with another addition to their family, a beautiful bay mare for her to ride. "I thought it was time you had your own horse," he explained as Clara admired the gentle animal. "She's steady enough that you could take Thomas with you when he's a bit older." Clara named the mare Starlight for the white blaze between her eyes. Having her own horse gave her a freedom she hadn't realized she missed, allowing her to ride alongside Keller when checking fences or visiting neighbors. As their second anniversary approached, Keller began work on their most ambitious project, yet a proper 2-story farmhouse to replace the expanded cabin. They had discussed it for months, planning each detail together. "It would have 4 bedrooms for the children we hope to have," as Clara put it, a large kitchen with a proper cookstove, and even a small library where Clara could store the books they'd been collecting. "Are you certain we can afford it?" Clara asked as they reviewed Keller's careful drawings one evening. Thomas was asleep in his crib, the house quiet except for the crackling fire. "The cattle sale brought more than expected," Keller assured her, "and I've been setting aside a portion of everything we've earned. We don't have to build it all at once, but I want to start. This land is ours now, Clara. I want to build something that will last, something worthy of what we've created together." Clara touched his face gently. "We already have that, my love, but I do like the idea of a proper library." Construction began in April 1881, with Keller directing a small crew of men from town and neighboring homesteads. Clara managed the existing farm work with help from young John, who had become a regular hand, while keeping an eye on Thomas, now a toddler with boundless energy. By summer, the frame of the house stood tall against the Oklahoma sky, a tangible symbol of how far they had come. Watching it take shape, Clara often thought back to the cave where Keller had found her, to the desperate woman she had been, and the life she could never have imagined awaited her. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the new house frame in gold, Clara shared news that would expand their family once more. "Thomas will have a brother or sister by winter," she told Keller, her eyes shining with joy. Keller whooped with delight, lifting her gently from her chair to spin her around. "Another baby. Thomas will be so excited to be a big brother." "He might be too young to understand just yet," Clara laughed. "But yes, I think he'll be a wonderful big brother." This pregnancy proved easier than the first, Clara's body remembering the way. Still, Keller insisted on hiring additional help for the farm so she could rest more, especially as the house construction continued. By October, they were able to move into the partially finished first floor of the new house, leaving their original cabin to serve as a bunkhouse for farm hands. On a snowy night in January 1882, Elizabeth Mary Daniels entered the world, a tiny bundle with her mother's auburn curls and her father's steady gaze. Thomas, not quite 2, approached his new sister with solemn curiosity, reaching out a chubby hand to pat her head. "Baby," he pronounced, his first clear word in weeks of babbling, making both parents laugh with delight. Life settled into new rhythms around the children. The farmhouse was completed by spring, a handsome white structure with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Keller and Clara's bedroom overlooked the eastern hills where the sun rose each morning. Thomas and Elizabeth had rooms adjoining the nursery that would one day house more children if they were so blessed. The promised library became Clara's sanctuary, filled with books ordered from as far away as St. Louis and Chicago. As 1883 dawned, their homestead had grown into one of the most prosperous in the area. Keller's careful management and Clara's innovative approaches to farming had paid dividends. They now employed 3 full-time hands, including John, who had proven himself invaluable. They had expanded beyond cattle to include sheep and a larger variety of crops. Clara's herbs and vegetables were sought after in town, and she had begun experimenting with preserves and jellies that brought premium prices. In May, they celebrated 5 years since filing the homestead claim, making the land officially theirs. The government deed arrived in June, and they framed it proudly in the entrance hall of their home. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked as they stood arm in arm looking at the framed document, "when you heard that gunshot and found me failing to shoot a rabbit?" Keller chuckled, pulling her close. "I knew you were special from the moment you pointed that rifle at me. Didn't know you'd change my life completely, though." Clara turned in his arms to face him. "You changed mine first. You built me a cabin when I had nothing." "And you built me a home when I had nowhere I belonged," Keller replied, kissing her softly. From upstairs came the sound of Thomas's laughter, followed by Elizabeth's happy gurgle. Outside, the land that had once seemed so hostile to Clara now flourished under their care, fields of wheat rippling in the breeze, orchards heavy with blossoms that promised autumn fruit, cattle grazing peacefully in green pastures. That evening, after the children were asleep, Keller and Clara walked hand in hand to the spot where her cave had been. The entrance had long since been filled in for safety, but a small marker stood there, a simple stone on which Keller had carved the date he had found her. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't heard that gunshot," Clara said softly. "I would have kept drifting," Keller replied, "kept running from memories instead of building new ones." He squeezed her hand. "But I did hear it, and I found you. And every day since has been a gift I never thought I'd deserve." Clara leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence as she had countless times over the years. "We built this life together, Keller, log by log, season by season. And we'll keep building," he promised. "For Thomas and Elizabeth, and maybe more children someday. For ourselves." As they walked back toward the farmhouse that glowed golden in the dusk, Clara thought about the desperate young woman who had fled Fort Smith with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination to survive. How could she have known that her lowest moment would lead her to this, a love that had built not just a cabin, but a life more beautiful than anything she could have imagined? In the years that followed, the Daniels family continued to thrive. Two more children joined them, Samuel in 1884 and Grace in 1886, completing their family. The homestead expanded to include a schoolhouse where Clara taught not only her own children but those of neighboring families, fulfilling her earlier calling as a teacher. Keller became known throughout the region for his fair dealings and agricultural innovations. When Oklahoma Territory was officially established in 1890, he was asked to serve on the first local governing council, a position he accepted with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything. The cave where Clara had once sheltered became part of family lore, a story told to the children about beginnings and courage, and the unexpected ways life could change. Sometimes, on summer evenings, Keller and Clara would sit on their porch, watching their children play in the yard of the home they had built together, marveling at the journey that had brought them there. "You ever miss drifting?" Clara asked him once, as they celebrated 20 years together. Keller shook his head, his hair now streaked with silver but his eyes as clear and determined as the day they'd met. "Not for a moment. Everything I need is right here." And it was true. From a chance encounter between a drifting cowboy and a desperate woman, they had built something that would endure long after they were gone, a legacy of love, determination, and the courage to begin again when all seemed lost. The cabin Keller had built for Clara still stood on their property, carefully preserved though no longer inhabited. It remained a tangible reminder of their beginning, of a man who had found his purpose in helping a stranger, and a woman who had found the strength to trust again. In the end, it wasn't just a cabin Keller had built, but a foundation for all that followed, a life neither of them could have imagined when a gunshot echoed across the Oklahoma plains and brought them together.